Ebuka was a hard-working shoemaker who lived in Lagos. He wasn't a rich man, but he was proud of the little he earned from fixing and making shoes. Ebuka had rented a small one-room apartment, which was just enough for him and his wife, Nkechi, a beautiful plus-size woman who loved him dearly. Life was simple, but happy for the couple. Soon after their marriage, Nkechi gave birth to their first child, a chubby little girl named Ada. She was full of energy, always giggling and crawling around the small room. Ebuka and Nkechi were overjoyed with their little Ada. But not long after, Nkechi became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to twin girls, Amara and Chika. Just like Ada, the twins were chubby, with round faces and bright eyes that filled their parents' hearts with love. As the girls grew older, their laughter and playful screams filled the tiny room. But with each passing day, the small space seemed to shrink. The one-room apartment that was once cozy for Ebuka and Nkechi now felt cramped and uncomfortable. There was hardly enough room for the girls to play, and their toys were always scattered everywhere. The bed was too small for the entire family, and the girls had to share a thin mattress on the floor. The neighbours noticed how cramped the family was and began to gossip about them. They would point and laugh whenever Ebuka or Nkechi passed by. "Look at them," they would say. "3 fat daughters in one tiny room. How do they even sleep at night?" At first, Ebuka tried to ignore them. He focused on his work, determined to save enough money to rent a bigger place. But the laughter and whispers became harder to ignore. The girls, especially Ada, were beginning to understand the hurtful words. Ada would come home from playing outside with tears in her eyes. "Papa, why do they laugh at us?" she asked one day, her voice trembling. Ebuka's heart broke. He didn't have an answer for her. He held her close and told her not to worry about what others said. But deep down, Ebuka felt the weight of their situation. He wished he could give his family a bigger and better home, but his earnings were barely enough to feed them and pay the rent. As time went on, the situation only got worse. The neighbours' laughter grew louder, and the girls became more aware of their cramped living conditions. Nkechi tried to keep the peace, but even she felt the strain of living in such a small space. The once happy home was now filled with tension and frustration. Ebuka knew he had to do something, but he didn't know where to start. The walls of the small room seemed to close in on him, and the laughter from outside echoed in his ears. One day, a particularly cruel neighbour named Mama Ibeji, who lived next door, said something that pushed Ebuka to his breaking point. As he was fixing shoes outside their apartment, she walked by with a smirk on her face. "Shoemaker, why don't you make shoes big enough to fit your daughters? They're growing too fat for this tiny room," she sneered. Ebuka clenched his fists, his face turning red with anger. But before he could say anything, Nkechi, who had overheard Mama Ibeji's comment, stepped out and calmly said, "Our girls are healthy and loved, and that is what matters most. A big heart is better than a big house." Her words silenced Mama Ibeji, but the damage was done. Ebuka felt more determined than ever to find a solution. He knew he couldn't let his family continue living like this, but what could he do? He had no savings, no support, and no idea where to turn. As he lay in bed that night, squeezed between Nkechi and the wall, with Ada, Amara, and Chika huddled on the floor, Ebuka stared at the ceiling and prayed for a way out of their troubles. Days turned into weeks, and the laughter from the neighbours only grew louder. But Ebuka refused to give up. He started working longer hours, taking on more shoe repairs, and even learned how to make new designs to attract more customers. Nkechi also did her part, selling snacks in the market to add to their income. Slowly their savings began to grow, but it still wasn't enough to rent a bigger apartment. One evening, as Ebuka was closing his shop, an old man approached him. The man was dressed in simple clothes with a kind face and wise eyes. "I've been watching you," the old man said. "You work hard and never complain. You take care of your family, and you do your best despite the challenges. I have something for you." Ebuka was puzzled. He didn't know who this old man was or what he could possibly have to offer, but he listened as the old man reached into his bag and pulled out a small wooden box. "Take this," the old man said, handing the box to Ebuka. "It's a special gift. Use it wisely and it will bring you what you need." Ebuka opened the box and found a tiny, well-made shoe inside. It was no bigger than his thumb and it glittered in the light. "What is this?" Ebuka asked, confused. "Trust in its magic," the old man replied. "But remember, it's not just the shoe that will help you. It's your heart, your hard work, and the love you have for your family that will make the magic work." With that, the old man disappeared into the night, leaving Ebuka standing alone with the tiny shoe in his hand. Ebuka wasn't sure what to think. Could this really be the answer to his prayers? He carefully placed the tiny shoe back in the box and took it home, eager to tell Nkechi what had happened. When he got home, he found Nkechi and the girls already asleep. The room was quiet except for the soft breathing of his daughters. Ebuka sat on the edge of the bed, holding the wooden box in his hands. He thought about the old man's words and wondered what kind of magic the tiny shoe could hold. The next morning, Ebuka showed the tiny shoe to Nkechi. She was just as puzzled as he was, but they both decided to keep it safe and see what would happen. Days went by, and nothing seemed to change. The neighbours continued to laugh, and the girls still had to sleep on the crowded floor. But Ebuka held on to the hope that something good would come from the old man's gift. One day, as Ebuka was working on a new pair of shoes, he accidentally knocked over the wooden box. The tiny shoe inside fell out and landed on the floor. As it did, something incredible happened. The room around him began to shimmer, and the walls seemed to stretch and expand. The tiny room grew larger and larger until it was no longer a cramped one-room apartment, but a spacious house with enough room for everyone. Ebuka could hardly believe his eyes. He rushed to find Nkechi, who was equally amazed. The girls ran around the new house, laughing and playing without bumping into each other. The neighbours who had once laughed at them now stared in shock and disbelief. They couldn't understand how Ebuka, the poor shoemaker, had suddenly moved into such a beautiful home. But Ebuka knew the truth. The tiny shoe was indeed magical, but it was more than just the shoe that had transformed their lives. It was the love, hard work, and determination that he and Nkechi had shown that made the magic come alive. From that day on, Ebuka never let the laughter of others bother him. He knew that as long as his family was together, nothing else mattered, and so Ebuka, Nkechi, Ada, Amara and Chika lived happily in their new home. The neighbours eventually stopped laughing, and some even came to Ebuka for advice and help. Ebuka's shoemaking business thrived, and he was able to provide for his family without worry. But most importantly, he knew that no matter how small or big their home was, it was the love inside that truly made it a home. As the sun set over their new house, Ebuka smiled and held his family close. He knew that they had gone through a difficult time, but they had come out stronger and closer than ever, and in his heart he was grateful for the tiny shoe and the magic it had brought into their lives.